really excited to talk to you about this timely and insightful book, No I in Team, that you've co-written. I know you've been, studying Canadian politics, broadly speaking, the power structures that obtain within Canada for a long time. But, this is a moment where, there's incredible levels of global instability. The current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who takes over from Justin Trudeau, has positioned Canada, after this viral Davos speech, for example, as an important middle power in the world. And I think is, demonstrating, I feel like Carney is kind of demonstrating some of the things that scholars like you have been pointing out for a long time, which is that the Prime Minister has a lot of power and holds a lot of sway in Canada. And it feels like that is not particularly well understood in some ways, like just how much power the executive actually wields in Canada, for a number of reasons. And I guess I wanted to ask about like the kind of core concern of the book, which is party discipline, a term that I think more people should have an understanding of. And the kind of profound limitations in some ways of like party discipline. This is like Canadian government, especially the federal government, has been described as a kind of friendly dictatorship, right? There's like this polite veneer, but it has a kind of dictatorial quality in certain ways. Can you kind of unpack the ways in which party discipline manifests itself in Canada, and how, it really is seemingly predicated on, number one, the power of the executive, and number two, the chilling of dissent. Like, dissent is not particularly welcome within, like, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, these two dominant political institutions in Canada. I think that's really important for us to start with, just so we're getting people on the same terms that we're working on.
Sure, and it's a great topic for me because the book that I did before this was about party discipline, and the book that I'm now deep into writing is about the power of the Prime Minister's office. So nestled in between that is this No I in Team book, which looks at party loyalty and to what extent parliamentarians are willing to consider changing party affiliations. When we talk about party discipline in Canada, we usually talk about how it is that a elected official to a provincial legislature or to the House of Commons, for the most part, is expected to vote the party line. They definitely are expected to vote the party line on major bills, particularly if they're a member of the governing party. So if you're a member of the opposition, you have more flexibility because there's not as much at stake, especially if you are part of a small party. Nobody really notices or cares much if you vote differently. But if you are part of the governing party and you don't support the budget, you don't support the throne speech, you don't support major legislation, you're essentially saying, listen, I don't agree with the premier or the prime minister, and that creates conversation. So when we talk about party discipline, there's a lot of elements that bring people together to vote together as a unified, cohesive group, particularly on the government side of the legislature. Now, how is it that they register dissent? In Canada, you go for a walk. You just don't vote. And that's how you show that you're angry about something. Or if you're going to register dissent, it's going to be on a low stakes matter where there's not really many consequences. And that way you can say, hey, I'm independent minded, even though the reality is that you fall in line on major votes. But we need to think about party discipline much more broadly than just votes, because as we said in this book, and as I've said in previous books, we now actually need to think about party discipline in terms of party message discipline. And really, that is people all saying the same thing in public, very different than how you vote in the legislature. The fact that you're going out and you're just constantly repeating whatever it is that the premier or the prime minister is saying, and you are endorsing not only what is being said, but you are parroting those message lines in speeches, on doorsteps, on social media. when you're talking to the media, the journalists. And so the idea is that now what happens is party leaders are presiding over a caucus of people who are mimicking what messaging they have, which is often developed by staff in consultation with public servants. So the bottom line is, when we think about party discipline, we're talking mostly about votes in unison in the legislature, but that has now evolved, and now it's become party message discipline, where we're talking about similar comments being made outside the legislature.
That's a great kind of opening salvo, and the way that it's sort of captured in the book, as you say, it's about, the book is focused on demystifying why team players who toe the party line typically attract little attention or critique, while acts of individualism are discouraged, and then when they do occur, are often dramatized as self-centered behaviors at odds with Canadian political culture. And I guess like that's interesting to me for us to kind of think through. It's like, what is it about the norms of Canadian political culture more broadly that makes someone like Carney kind of a perfect fit in certain ways, and someone like Polyev a little bit of an outsider, a little bit of a firebrand, a little bit of like that right populist mini Trump or whatever. These are the ways in which he's been described. The norms of Canadian political culture seem to kind of provide the frame with which folks understand acts of dissent as outliers, as like abnormal, and maybe impolite. Did you want to say anything about that sort of element of this and what the consequences are of Canadian democracy not normalizing a little bit of dissent, disagreement, discord? Like, we have very little tolerance for that, and folks who want to make change have to kind of work within the parameters of those norms, right?
Yeah, but I think when we think about the political culture, I think it depends on where you're coming from and what your perceptions might be. And certainly, if there was a generic culture, it's that somehow Canadian parliamentarians are expected to be polite and deferential, and those who are seen as braggarts or individualistic or free thinkers are seen as people who are not team players and don't belong as part of a political party that expects a degree of conformity. And so, one of the major differences here, when you mention Carney versus Polyev, is Carney is very much part of the sort of liberal institutional elite that very much controls or at least shapes a lot of the political culture in Canada. It has for a long time, particularly out of sort of the what they call the Laurentian elites, which is sort of the Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto corridor. But then Polyev represents much more of a conservative way of thinking, which is more sort of prairies, firebrand, challenging the Ottawa elite networks, and very much being a bit of a bulldog, saying all sorts of things that shake up norms. And for people who prefer sort of the calmness of established institutions, he's seen as an outsider. And yet, for other people, he's seen as someone who's needed to shake things up. So, I think you're right to say that Carney represents part of an established political culture. It's just that not everybody shares that culture.
Yeah, I like that analysis a lot. It because like the your work is an attempt in a lot of ways to sort of like see patterns in the kind of fog of war that takes place in the context of Canadian politics too, and to look at the rise of polarization in historical context. Like you do make it clear in No Iron Team that like polarization is presenting new challenges, that the kind of spectacularization of politics in some ways is inherently like shaking up even this sort of very formal, like institutionalized, professionalized form of politics that we have in Canada, which I think is helpful, right? Like just for kind of helping us zoom out and understand how even the norm of unity is fracturing a little bit. And, I want to kind of maybe think about this in relationship to the long shadow cast by Justin Trudeau, right? Like you point out there's like a case in point when it comes to Trudeau around basically how that fracturing is taking place. So, like, the Liberal Party has been the de facto, like, ruling party of Canada for the history of the nation. But you say that the power of the Prime Minister's office is not absolute, and we can see that in how, in the context of this new kind of celebrity form of leadership, the Liberal Party became intimately connected to Justin Trudeau. And I'll quote the book: even as his and the party's approval ratings collapsed heading into an election year, most Liberals balked at the betrayal of calling for him to step down. It was not until Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and longtime Trudeau loyalist, posted her resignation from cabinet on social media in just December 2024, right? Recent history, that regional caucuses were finally galvanized to demand a change in leadership. Can you talk a little bit about like what that moment, like how you kind of responded to that moment? In some ways, how the book actually seems to like pivot on what that moment reveals about a sea change in Canadian politics, because you say it does seem to like demonstrate the limits of a leader's control over their party, even one built around a cult of personality. Are we seeing how celebrity leadership in this age is sort of, causing a little bit of like openings, cracks to emerge within this like very kind of institutionalized edifice of the Liberal Party, even?
Well, yeah, I guess the Liberal Party has certainly been the dominant party, particularly since the 1920s, or more specifically since 1935. But you know, Justin Trudeau was very much, kind of wrapped into the core identity of what it means to be a liberal because of his name, because of who he is and was. And so, for a lot of people, the idea that you would say anything untoward about Trudeau was not only saying something about going against the prime minister, but it was essentially saying something against all liberals, that somehow you were a bad liberal if you were to do this. I think the thing about Freeland's shock resignation, aside from the fact that social media nowadays is where, you know, letters of resignation get posted and we see them right away, and we're all part of that conversation in a very dramatic manner with Freeland, is that the timing really mattered with her. She, announced it on the day that she was meant to deliver the fall economic statements. All eyes were trained on her anyway, so she timed it explicitly. But the reality is, if she had done that at an earlier point, Trudeau would have survived. So, he survived Jody Wilson-Raybould stepping down. He survived Bill Morneau being pushed out, and he had other ministers who left. But she was essentially almost like he was teetering on a cliff, and she's the one who pushed him over it. And so that's that. But what it does do is a reminder that prime ministers and premiers are only in power as long as they have the support of their caucus. So the key thing here is that one senior minister can potentially make a difference, but there have to be a lot of other factors going on. And at that particular point, Trudeau was pretty low in the polls, and so she just kind of gave voice to something that was already happening. Whereas I think that, for the most part, if you're looking to remove a prime minister, you have to have the numbers. There have to be quite a number of people behind you. You could even look at what's happening over in Britain with Keir Starmer, and that, you know, he's very low in the polls, and yet people are still reluctant to say we need to change him because he's only been there a couple of years. So timing matters. The closer you get to an election, which is also what happened with Freeland, all sorts of Liberal MPs were worried about their own jobs, and they felt there was a need for a change in leadership in order to have any chance of getting reelected, which proved to be true, actually. So, yeah, I think the reality is, though, the main thing, well, one of the things that we argue in this book is that there are strength in numbers. So if you were an average, Chrystia Freeland was no average MP, no average minister. But for the average elected official, if you want to be able to affect change, aside from, the occasional person who works really hard at a particular issue, has credibility in it because of lived experience or something, for the most part, you're going to have to build a coalition. You're going to have a lot of people in the caucus supporting you. It's really hard for a leader to impose discipline and sanctions and punishments if there's a whole bunch of you. If there's only one of you, they can pick you off. But if there's a group of you, that becomes a problem.
Yeah, a little bit of like a Game of Thrones maneuvering is taking place. But, I want us to really spend some time talking about some of the solutions that the book proposes. I think those really are crucial. This book is not just about punching holes, and I'm sympathetic to some of its prescriptions also. But before we get there, I guess like it makes sense for us to like diagnose what some of the chronic problems are and what the solutions are meant to solve. So I think like kind of hanging over all of it in Canada is what some scholars have called the paradox of reform. So the fact that like the only achievable reform in a very unilateral system with party discipline like Canada's is like self-regulation, right? It's you have to have the leading party kind of consent to the reform for it to have any to gain any momentum, and there's just no incentive for the government to actually institute reforms that aren't going to benefit that party. And there's lots of examples of this, so I wanted to kind of bring those to you and see what you think. And maybe you can help us by like pointing to moments where there have been attempts at reform, right? So the most concerning one for me as a communicator is Canada's freedom of information policy, right? I guess we don't have. Like Canada doesn't precisely have a freedom of information policy of the type that would allow the press to compel the government to give sensitive information. What we have is, I think, an Access to Information Act where the prime minister seems to have a lot of control, right? They can call a public inquiry only when it serves their interests and so on and so forth. And there have been attempts to reform the AIA under Chrétien, even Stephen Harper. There were like moments where discussion papers and so on were brought to him, but none of them went anywhere. Like we don't seem to actually have greater transparency of the type that apparently Canadians largely assume we have, right? So there's a disconnect between assumptions Canadians have about the access to information legislation and the one that sort of exists. Can you sort of like walk us through those attempts at reform, where we are in terms of access to information in Canada, and what the implications might be of that sort of gap between what we believe we have in terms of government transparency and accountability and what actually exists within the Canadian political structure?
Yeah, I think the best way for me to answer that is that, I don't have particular expertise in the legislation involving access to information, although I do file access to information requests and find them very helpful. But to your original point in question is that, this whole paradox where the people who are in positions of power don't have a lot of incentives to change rules that benefit them, is obviously a perpetual challenge. The key one that comes up all the time is the electoral system. Why would you change an electoral system that when you're in opposition, you want to change, but once you got elected on it, you're going to want to be able to keep it. For me, the big recommendations we have in the book is there's need to be change to the rules of proceedings in legislatures. These are known as the standing orders in the House of Commons. One rule change that I think would be helpful is to require that anybody who wants to cross the floor to have to sit as an independent for 30 days, minimum 30 days, before they be allowed to go to another caucus. And the reason for that is because it would provide a cooling off period. It would reduce the ability for a prime minister to offer a cabinet post. It would cause some conversation and give constituents some warning that somebody's thinking about doing this, instead of one day, all of a sudden you see this, images in the news of somebody standing there with the prime minister or another party leader they campaigned against, and voters get very upset. So the thing is about changing the standing orders is this is not a vote winner. You would have to really be a parliamentary purist to have any interest in this, because you've got to be able to mobilize almost everybody in the legislature to agree with you. And so, why would people spend time on this if the public's not talking about it, if they don't care about it? The best example I can come up with isn't that long ago. It was Michael Chong, who's a conservative MP. Some people may know who he is because in 2006, he was briefly a minister before Harper. I don't know if it was clear if he resigned or if he was kicked out, but it was over the whole thing about recognizing Quebec as a nation within Canada. In any event, Michael Chong's a long-standing MP, very much interested in parliamentary democracy. And in 2014, he advanced a private member's bill that ended up becoming law after a lot of changes, known as the Reform Act. And that brought in all sorts of little changes, one of which allows a caucus to opt in to have the ability to trigger a leadership review and replace the leader. And so this was just stuff that, it's very much what we would call inside baseball. It has made a difference because that legislation is what allowed the Conservatives to get rid of Aaron O'Toole after the Conservatives did not win win the most seats after the 2021 election, although they did win the popular vote. And it's also a mechanism that could potentially topple Pierre Poilievre if he's not careful. But the bottom line is people don't talk about this stuff unless you're really into the weeds. So there's not much incentive for the average Canadian to pay much attention to it. Same thing I would say with access to information legislation. Those of us who pay attention to government, those of us who are using access to information care about these things. I'm not so sure the average Canadian is so concerned about it when they're worried about the price of gas, the price of groceries, and other things.
That's key. I think like those social tipping points or focusing events really crucially matter. But the last thing you said brings to mind a conversation I just had with Aaron Hagee McKay of the Goose podcast and social media presence, which is like the satirical take on Canadian politics. And he basically said like the carbon tax was obviously political suicide from the beginning. That like from his perspective, any policy where you primarily seem to be penalizing Canadians by raising the price of energy is not going to work unless you communicate it very, very effectively, very strategically. And you write about the carbon tax in interesting ways in the book. You say, despite years of the Liberal government advocating that the consumer carbon price was vital for addressing climate change, really it seemed to stall out. And then you document in the preface, again, like in really compelling ways, the Carney moment where he theatrically signs a decision note in front of the media, I'm quoting the book, to cancel the carbon tax, echoing, you say, the performative authority of a U.S. president issuing an executive order. I think like this really is important for understanding the key place of energy in our politics, right, in Canada, where, I mean, if you're following the news right now in Canada, you are led to believe that a pipeline is primarily a good idea. That for the most part, we gain energy sovereignty, independence through reinvesting in fossil fuel infrastructure. I'm seeing not enough constructive dissent around this thing, right? And I kind of wanted to ask you about thinking back to the book, how you see it as intervening basically within this sort of like long history of inaction around energy and environmental policy in Canada. Because the book is not foregrounding its author's politics per se. It's not like aggressively taking a position. If it's taking a position, it's saying that we need to validate, and make normal like contestation within Canada, within Canada's political culture. And I'm just not seeing enough of that when it comes to carbon in particular. So I wonder if you could maybe expand on that.
Well, I mean, I guess I could counter and say, well, the whole time that Justin Trudeau was prime minister, the norm seemed to be that in certain circles that a price on carbon was the best possible way forward. And yet there were a lot of people, not just conservatives, but especially people in rural Canada, who had a lot of concerns with that approach. And so, that in a way was what led to its undoing because eventually they ended up having this carve out for to some extent for Atlantic Canada because of special circumstances, and that became a slippery slope to eventually, Carney and withdrawing it because so many people were so angry about it. I think that the lesson really is that whether it's Trudeau promoting efforts to deal with climate change, or whether it's Carney who seems to be doing things to undermine those types of efforts, either way, Liberal MPs are going along with the leader. And the one exception to that, who really stands out to me, is Stephen Guilbeault, who is the Minister of Environment um, under Trudeau, and who ended up resigning from cabinet as an act of protest, and yet still stays as a Liberal MP. I mean, I don't get it. If you were so angry about something, resign your seat entirely. Like, say, I'm done with the Liberal Party, but somehow that was an expression of anger that, I mean, I don't understand how somebody like that, it would be so environment, so green, so pro-environmental, and supportive of climate change activism. Could it all stay within the Carney government? And not just that, there's a whole bunch of Liberal MPs who, and some of them former Trudeau ministers, who are very much concerned about the environment, very much concerned about climate change. And yet somehow they're sitting on their hands. I mean, I don't get it. And when I say I don't get it, it's because that is the norm in Canadian politics, that somehow, if you are going to express concerns, they have to be done behind closed doors. And if you somehow express disagreement in public, there's going to be a whole weight of anger and animosity that gets dropped on you.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this topic, and I don't want to. I don't want to, disabuse myself of the role of like interviewer and become the commentator. It's something I care very deeply about. The podcast has been largely an attempt to advocate for a very revolutionary politics of, clean energy transition, a just transition, and people know that if they listen. And I also don't want to talk about my day job, which is within municipal government, trying to mainstream climate action. I know folks who are currently Liberal MPs. I've worked with them, and I know that they feel a level of cognitive dissonance and, conflict about needing currently to toe the line around energy in particular, knowing what it's going to do. So, yeah, that's all I'll say. There are other things that we could talk about too, where there seems to be a real contradiction between people's stated politics and then their political actions, whether it's the complete lack of any accountability in the face of Bill C-12, despite the social damage that bill now law will cause and the degree to which it totally disregards Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There's, Carney's made lots of announcements about the federal government's investment in affordable housing, but we haven't really seen much action. So people that care intensely about that and that are seeing, I mean, there are 85,000 roughly unhoused folks in Ontario alone, right? Those are people that you're seeing in front of your city hall, right? So it's
Yeah, but
astonishes
you
me.
know what you're not seeing? You're not seeing them get elected to Parliament. You're not seeing them get elected to
That's right.
positions, right? So this
Yeah.
is one of the many challenges, that we don't have legislatures that truly reflect a broad composition of the public. We tend to talk and often hear about, it's very important to make sure that women are in cabinet. It's important to make sure that we have different forms of diversity, but those tend to be things that are not based on occupation, they're not based on social class, and they're not necessarily based on income levels. And certainly they're not based on whether you happen to be living on the streets or not. And so one of the things I would say is, gee, wouldn't it be refreshing to have somebody who has lived on the streets to actually be a member of cabinet? I mean, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, like the idea, yes, I 100% agree that like the notion of diversity, equity, inclusion that we might bring to reforming Canadian politics is totally, it excludes class. Considerations of class are, um,
Yeah,
I
or they
don't
might
know,
be embedded within it, right?
maybe,
So
yeah, yeah,
you could say that somebody who's racialized woman There
Mm,
might be in deemed a
sure.
different class that excludes them.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is we don't tend to talk about some of the other, broader elements that don't have to do with some of those traditional ways of looking at things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, it produces such a profound, I think, like abyss between, the performative politics of Parliament and your average Canadian, who, Reclimate, this research center, polled a number of Canadians. Seth Klein has also polled Canadians around like energy and environment. And for the most part, people are concerned with climate change, are thinking about it like almost every day, believe that others are not thinking about it, that there are more pressing concerns, and that, their research shows Canadians would generally, even Canadians largely in Alberta, would prefer for Canada to be moving in the direction of renewable energy. But there's this disconnect. Anyway, I don't want to pontificate about that. I want to maybe get to some of the interesting prescriptions and what the solutions that your book is offering, might mean in terms of like, again, like kind of trying to work within the coordinates of what's possible in Canada. It's not as though you're necessarily advocating for like this radical breaking of the political norms, presumably because you don't really believe that those are feasible. I'm super sympathetic to, and I think this dovetails with what we were just talking about in terms of like trying to really broaden the tent of official politics in Canada. I'm really sympathetic to this prescription in the book for, quote, multi-partisan training for rookies. That's brilliant, I think. Training for rookies, political rookies. Changes to legislative procedures to reduce party dominance, constraints on the confidence convention. It seems like these would actually offer a pragmatic path toward constructive dissent. Can you maybe, like, because I wanted more on that idea of multi partisan training for rookies. I think that's really interesting because I see people who are incredibly enthusiastic and have all kinds of brilliant like ideas enter Canadian politics and then sort of receive the discipline, receive message discipline, receive the idea that there will be consequences for dissent, and then need to soften their kind of radicalism, I'll call it. And I see that that's heartbreaking to me, right? Do you maybe imagine that this sort of training would allow for people to understand the logistics of procedure differently? What does it mean to describe it as multi-partisan training? Can you just like expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, maybe a starting point is to think about the odd sort of situation we have in democracy, which is that, if you wanted to be an accountant, you'd have to have some training to be an accountant. If you wanted to be a dentist, if you wanted to be a lawyer, I mean, there's all these expectations that you would have to, not only that, there would have to be some accreditation, etc. To become a parliamentarian, to become a legislator, there is no requirement for any of that. And I'm not suggesting there has to be a requirement. You would obviously be excluding people if you did. But then it begs a question of if you get elected, how do you learn how these things work? Where do you get the training? And frankly, as the Samara Center of Democracy based in Toronto has said, the role of an MP is a job without a description. And you basically learn on the job. And how is it you're learning? Well, you're mostly learning by mimicking the behaviors and the established processes and culture of the people who are there before you or who have more experience than you. So this creates all sorts of issues. So there would be feminists who say, well, these are all structures that were designed by men. And then there would be others who say, well, actually, in fact, they were white privileged men, and immediately you have a starting point that might be different than how you might design it if you were to start today. But more than that, the rules are, there to really over time support the government for moving things forward. So the original idea behind a parliamentary democracy was that the people's elected representatives would hold the government to account. What's happened is over time is the people's elected representatives, the ones who hold them to account are in the opposition side. But the ones who we need holding the government to account are actually the backbenchers on the governing party side, of whom there are very many, and who are not members of cabinet, and are instead they've become what I often argue, they've become brand ambassadors. So essentially, they are people who are out promoting and supporting the government, but not really providing critical thought. Well, why is that? It's because they don't know enough. They don't, a lot of them are spending all this time learning the system. And, it's that expression about you're drinking through a fire hose. And sometimes we also have something that political scientists call amateurism in Canadian politics, which is there's so much turnover at every election. You have a brand new crop of people being brought in that people who have learned things are often having to leave and they're not reelected or they step down or whatever it is. So the problem is that you need some sort of training. So the idea that my co-authors and I have brought up forward is that, listen, if you get elected to a legislature, maybe it would be a good idea to have some training brought forward by not just political scientists, because frankly, they often don't know what's happening in legislatures, but people who have left party politics, bring people together from different parties to explain how the system works and how it could be even better. Because right now, the training that they receive, aside from modeling behavior based on the partisans who are there, you have members of the legislature, staffers, who provide advice, but that is all very procedural, and often it's human resource based. So you become a member of parliament, and the focus is on how to get your office set up, how to get your security key, how is it that you hire people, how do you get computers ordered. It's not about how do you scrutinize a bill on its way to becoming law.
I love that. And I think, once again, it's like, it's a reform. It's like, it feels like low hanging fruit to just like create a container for that sharing of knowledge. I see a lot of potential in that. And it goes to or reinforces the point made in the book that, so much of this change must come, you say, from backbenchers. A term that kind of says it all, right? They're in the background. They're sort of NPCs. They're non-player characters. They don't really have that much agency. And yeah, as you just sort of underlined, those backbenchers have a particularly important role within the governing party. And the thing you say is they must rise above institutional, political, social, and technological pressures and recognize the dangers of blind, unwavering party loyalty. Um, I like that is both sort of idealistic and realistic in some sense. Like it's talking about the real consequences, and maybe we should conclude to some extent by just sort of talking about the consequences of the paradox of reform, party loyalty, and the potential role of backbenchers in the struggle to redesign Canada's electoral system to make it more representative. Because, no party, including most recently Justin Trudeau's Liberals, has followed through on their campaign commitments to reform the first past the post system. And, few organizations in Canada, media and otherwise, really made a like earnest effort to hold Trudeau, for example, accountable for this failure, really. Um, can you maybe just sort of help us triangulate here the problem of party discipline, loyalty, and the potential role of backbenchers in relationship to the inability or unwillingness of the executive branch in Canada to reform this system that has effectively, chained the country to the same ruling party since Confederation almost.
Uh, well, you know, political parties change and evolve over time. So it's not just the electoral system that has enabled the Liberals to be so successful. However, not enough people talk about the fact that, as I indicated earlier, the Conservatives are the ones who not only did they get the most votes in the 2021 election, but they got the most votes in the 2019 election. And, for those people who think the electoral system is problematic, they would have to accept the fact that we'd have a conservative, that Justin Trudeau would have been there for 4 years, and the Conservatives would have gotten in 2019. Not only would the Conservatives have formed a government in 2019, they would have formed a government in 2021, all things being equal. Um, it's not just the executive that this is an issue with. It's actually the members, the elected members. The elected members are the ones who are screaming, saying, "Do not change the electoral system because if you do, I might not get reelected." So there's a lot of pressure brought to bear on the leader to maintain the status quo. But for what it's worth, you are right when you point out this book that we're careful in terms of the kinds of comments that we make and positions. But one position that I've come to after studying party politics in Canada for as much as I have is that anybody who promotes a change to the electoral system that would give political parties more power, that would further institutionalize political parties and suppress the ability of independence or independent thinking and voices, that needs to be stopped. Because we already have a situation where political parties have a lot of control over access to legislatures. Independents rarely get elected in this country, and even when they are elected, they have very little say in what it is that they can do in the legislature. The rules are completely stacked against them because political parties want the rules to favor them. So I from my perspective, before we even start talking about major reforms to the electoral system, how about we have a conversation about whether the poor independent legislator, who perhaps should have more agency in Parliament, and who also should have rules that are not stacked against them during election campaigns. They have harder time fundraising because of the rules. They don't get access to the list of electors because of the rules. These are all things designed to make it really hard for independents to get elected.
Yeah, no, super insightful and really interesting. Like, well, I think, unfortunately, civic education in Canada doesn't, I don't think, foreground some of these frictions that exist, because it's perhaps too risky to foreground the degree of like unfreedom that seems to actually exist within Canadian politics. But I find it kind of inspiring in some ways, because it suggests that another system is possible, that this was not the only one that we could have had, and that there are real benefits to trying to kind of have more friction, like to chafe against some of these conventions. Anyway, yeah, I won't take any more of your time today, but I really appreciate you helping me get a deeper understanding of this book, and I look forward to these other projects that you're working on. Remind me again, you said it at the beginning, so you're working on a book on the
I'm
Prime
working on a
Minister's
book right now, about explaining the role of political staff in the Prime Minister's office and ministers' offices. So I'm trying to, kind of a bit descriptive in explaining how things work, but also, trying to unpack to what extent should we be concerned about the amount of power that unelected officials have in government.
Nice. Well, I hope we can chat about that as well down the road, but good luck with everything, and thanks for talking to me today.
All right, thanks for having me on, Scott.